Welcome to yet another Rollin' Rambles. Today we're going to talk about my Dunning-Kruger effect, my youthful ignorance. We're going to talk about a 486 and the amount of time I may have wasted, the amount of life I may have wasted because I thought I was smart and it turned out I wasn't. A long time ago, it wasn't a Star Wars movie, it was just me in my youth. 14, 15, something like that. Anyway, the only way I really had to get on internet was to use AOL, America Online. Oh, good old America Online. Anyway, you had to install the America Online client and use it to dial up and log into an AOL account, and that would then patch your computer into the internet. Once you were on AOL, you could run Internet Explorer or Netscape or whatever you wanted. Always better than the built-in browser in AOL, because if you got disconnected, it would close every window that you had open inside of AOL and kick you back to the sign-in screen. Not exactly ideal if you were actually doing something of value, and then AOL just kind of closes everything you were doing. So, anyway, back in the day, I had a 486 at my mom's. This 486, I don't exactly remember where I got it, but I think I got it. It was some sort of surplus deal. Anyway, it was not a very fast computer. I just realized, for those of you who don't know what a 486 is, so the lineage of computer processors, these days everybody has like a Core i series or an AMD, whatever, AMD Ryzen, this, that, and the other. But a long time ago, that was not what you had. In the early 2000s, 01, 02, Windows XP was coming out, and the Pentium 4 was the latest, greatest, most amazing thing from Intel that used way too much power and was actually very inefficient compared to its power usage. There were basically little heaters that sat under your desk. So the Pentium 4 was 2002. This video is 2024. We're already talking about stuff from 22 years ago. Now, a Pentium 4, well, let's go back to 486. Pentium 3, late 90s. Pentium 2, mid to late 90s, basically. Pentium Pro, which technically is what the Pentium 2 was, the Pentium Pro with major improvements, but the Pentium 2 replaced the Pentium Pro, which was pretty short-lived, and then the Pentium. Now, where's the 486 and all that? Well, Pentium, Pent, like Pentagon, 5. So the Pentium was unofficially, or even officially, the chip number was the 80586, the Pentium. The Pentium Pro was 80686, and they stopped doing that numbering after the Pentium Pro. The 486 is the chip before the original Pentium from the early to mid 90s. We're talking early 90s tech, but we're talking late 90s software. On this 486, I believe I was running Windows 3.1, no, Windows for Workgroups 3.11, which is still not Windows 95, and the AOL client, and that was the way I got online. This thing had like 4 megabytes of RAM, if I recall correctly. Now, here's the problem. It had 4 megabytes of RAM, so it could barely get on the internet in the late 90s. I want you to think about that for a second. We have a very resource-starved system that can just barely do what I'm trying to do with it. In fact, a lot of software I ran on this, I would actually drop to DOS and run it in pure DOS because it was so limited. So on this 486, to get on AOL, I would have to dial up, open an internet window that was basically embedded Internet Explorer, and that's it. But it was slow. Now, normally, if a computer was slow back then, there were a lot of things you could change. I knew that the RAM was very limited, so it was going to be doing some paging, some swap. It was going to be taking unused pieces of RAM and copying them out to the hard drive, then marking those pages as freed to make them available for other things. What I did not know is how I would effectively shoot myself in the technical foot. by trying to solve this problem. So I want to walk you through the troubleshooting methodology that I had back then. And I want you to understand how I got where I did before ending up in a worse place. So, 486. Resource limited, specifically the resource is RAM. Hard drives are notoriously slow, which means anything that swaps out of RAM is going to be extremely, horribly, just beyond belief, dirt slow. Hard drives back then were the same speed that dirt cheap USB 2 flash drives were 5 years ago. And that's to say they were bad. Single digit megabytes a second. And if you were doing thrashing, if you had a lot of traffic going in and out of the drive, it was even worse than that. So, you basically had a system that was suboptimal for everything ever. Now, AOL is not a small program. Browsing the internet requires some space to do it, so you need RAM. You need as much RAM as you can cram into that box. Unfortunately, the problem is I couldn't do that. I didn't have any money. The computer was given to me. I had no way of upgrading it, so I was pretty screwed. I had to make the most of what I have. So, I know that the program uses a lot of RAM because it's AOL. Of course it does. I know it's going to be paging a lot. So, my thought was I really need to make more RAM available in any way that I can. So, of course, I trimmed the fat. Anything that might be a startup item or a driver that I don't need or whatever, anything from config sys, autoexec bat, any of the startup files, trim them out. Right? Okay, that's fine. When that runs out, what do you do? Well, if you are running Windows 3.1 or Windows for Workgroups 3.11 in 386 enhanced mode, which they a lot of times just called enhanced mode, then you have full virtual memory, 32-bit paging, all of it. And one of the great things about it is this paging system lets you extend the RAM and is very, very tunable. So, we tune the paging. How do we tune the paging? It's simple. I have a bunch of RAM, so what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to make sure there's plenty of paging room to dump stuff out. But this is where things get dicey, because having a bunch of paging space doesn't matter if it doesn't get paged out, but that doesn't affect performance. What does affect performance is what came next. In the bottom right corner of the 386 enhanced mode control panel that lets you control virtual memory and paging, there's a little box that lets you set a number of kilobytes. And that number of kilobytes is how much of your RAM do you want to set aside for use as a disk cache. Now, in the days of Windows, I think even just 95 and up, you have a dynamic cache. You can set limits. You can set a minimum and a maximum cache size, but it's dynamic. So if you have 128 megs of RAM and the limit is 64 megs of cache, a program needs 100 megs. That's going to require that you get rid of a bunch of the cache. So it can evict and shrink the cache down as needed. This is not how things worked in the days of DOS and Windows 3.1 at all. So when you have DOS or Windows 3.1, your caching is actually run by a program called Smart Drive that you run in the startup files. Smart Drive determines the caching. And Windows, it also did caching, and I think it did it through Smart Drive, and I think it just reached into Smart Drive and tweaked it. But in the DOS days, Smart Drive, you would set the disk cache size, and that would pretty much be it. That RAM was always set aside for disk cache. So it's not dynamic. It doesn't reduce cache size based on extreme memory pressure. It just is like, oh, you set aside half a megabyte for cache, 512 kilobytes. Well, that's your cache. So out of 4,096 kilobytes, you set aside half a megabyte, which is 512 kilobytes, and that's it. That's your disk cache. And I think Smart Drive let you set a minimum and normal, or minimum and maximum. But it's been so long I don't remember the exact details, but it doesn't really matter either. The point is, you would set aside a certain amount of cache, and then when you boot it up, that's how much cache you had, and you couldn't just get rid of it, and you couldn't just add to it, and that's basically the end of it. So, logically, AOL needs a ton of RAM. It's paging like crazy, right? That's what we assume. Keep in mind, this is also way before any of the Windows Performance Kit stuff that I could get my hands on today to test that stuff. The hard drive's clattering away. You assume it's paging because you know AOL's huge. You go in there and you turn down the cache size. It got to where I was setting the disk cache to the smallest numbers possible. 64 kilobytes, 32 kilobytes, 4 kilobytes. Like, how much more RAM does this stupid thing need to stop paging so aggressively? And I was getting really annoyed, but the problem was it would literally take, because of the disk thrashing, it would literally take minutes sometimes when at its worst point for like one picture to load over the dial-up connection. And that means the computer was slower than the dial-up connection. So the picture was not limited. It was not limited based on, in the load time, based on the dial-up connection being such a slow POS. It was limited because the computer couldn't keep up with the dial-up link. Wow, right? Like, holy crap. The computer couldn't keep up with a dial-up link? That doesn't even seem possible. And then one day, I was running something else. And I had problems with the drive thrashing and everything going slower than a dead dog. And I started to realize, I had this sudden epiphany that I was a moron. I went into the 386 enhanced control panel. I turned the disk cache size up to like, I don't know, I can't remember, but it was probably 512 kilobytes, if not 1024, which is 1 megabyte. It's probably a megabyte. Out of 4 megabytes, it was probably 25% of the RAM. Surely that will make AOL page horrifically. Fix the problem. It fixed the problem. I misidentified it as paging out aggressively all the time due to not having nearly enough RAM. But what ended up really happening is the cache was too small, and my response to the cache being too small was to make the cache even smaller, which made the problem worse, which made the disk thrashing so bad as to be almost unusable. And as soon as I went in and cranked that cache up and tried AOL again, everything ran smooth as silk. It wasn't paging, it was going back to the disk and reading information that it had read before but didn't remember, because that's what the disk cache does. It prevents things that are frequently accessed on disk from having to be accessed again on disk by keeping some of it right there in RAM, any of the most heavily or recently used stuff right there, so you don't have to keep going out and getting it. But I had reduced the cache to near non-existence. And because of this, it had no choice. It had to go back out and read literally everything it needed. AOL is not a small program. Even back then in 99 or 2000, whatever it was, AOL was not a small program. It barely ran on the computer, and it had a lot of moving parts. And all of those moving parts required that AOL go and fetch things on demand, and that meant frequently reading, purging, and rereading things as needed or not needed. Unfortunately, that meant that every time it would purge something, free up some memory, it doesn't need this component anymore, so unload it. Then when it went to reload it, it wasn't in the disk cache, and you're screwed. Really crappy back then. But the whole problem is that I thought that I had identified the problem. I had no way of knowing for sure that that was the problem. I took a crappy guess based on prior experience and knowledge, but not a lot of it. And the guess was wrong, and I actually did the wrong thing. This is how you learn. You make stupid mistakes, live with the consequences of your stupid mistakes, and then grow from them. I can tell you one thing right now. Every computer after that got a really, really fat disk cache. I tell you what, every Windows 95 and 98 machine, you go into that system.ini file, find the vcache section, and I would set the minimum and maximum file cache sizes to something pretty darn generous, because that mistake was never happening again. Not with my computer, not with my customers' computers, none of it. And so, to this day, I haven't had to do it in a long time, but to this day, I have always set the cache parameters much more intelligently, because I understand better that the cache is more important than the paging for a variety of reasons, at least to a certain point. And so I don't make the same mistake where I don't give it enough resources. Talk about a bad trip down memory lane. Anyway, if you're still here and you're interested in retro computing and you want to run especially Windows 98 or Millennium Edition, but also this applies to 95. No, it doesn't. It only applies to 98 and up. In 98, they changed the Windows Virtual Memory Manager to where it would aggressively page out information so that there was always free RAM for any big thing that tried to load. On paper, this aggressive paging of data out of RAM so that you can have as much free RAM as possible sounds like a very good idea. Because if you have a bunch of empty space, then you don't have to worry about that empty space not being available if something loads. So one of the problems that you would deal with back in the day was exactly what I thought AOL was doing. You load some big thing, a bunch of RAM gets used. Once a bunch of RAM gets used, now that RAM's not available, okay, and it also means you have to evict caches or other things have to be paged out, which means a long wait to start programs, because now you're not just starting the program, you're throwing a whole bunch of other stuff that's already in RAM out to the disk. So you double, triple, quadruple, or worse the wait times to actually load the software into RAM and start executing it. So they tried to fix that with this aggressive paging. Unfortunately, the net effect of it was, as soon as anything loaded, it wasn't very long at all before it started sending it right back out to the paging file. So if you load anything, it gets paged back out. You can imagine how useless this is. It's so aggressive that it'll start paging stuff out that you just loaded. It tries to keep RAM free all the time, but unused RAM is wasted RAM. And the worst part is, you've already blown the caches. You've already tossed the disk cache to load the stuff into the RAM. And what's the point of the disk cache if now everything you load just gets kicked back out to the paging file? So you end up with the opposite scenario. The thing's paging so hard, trying to be proactive, that it actually pages things out that never would have paged out in the first place. This was the major reason that Windows 98 was so much slower than Windows 95. So many people think it was active desktop. So many people think Windows Millennium Edition System Restore is why it was so slow. But it's not. It's the aggressive swap file usage. Fortunately, if you go to system.ini, under the vcache section, there is the same place you'd put min file cache size and max file cache size to set the number of kilobytes the disk cache can be, minimum and maximum. If you go there, you can add another line, initial caps for every word, swap file is a single word, conservative swap file usage equals 1. Now, Windows 98 Millennium Edition's memory management reverts to Windows 95 style memory management, where it doesn't aggressively page things out to disk anymore. You do this one line, and all of a sudden, Windows 98 and ME feel like Windows 95 again. The speed problem instantly goes away with a single restart. You don't even have to reboot. Windows 95 and 98 and all that, they were technically really complicated DOS shells. So you can actually exit Windows to DOS and then jump back in by running the win command again. And it would boot, and it would fire Windows right back up with the new parameters. It stopped aggressively paging, which meant things ran normally. It would only page when you started to run out of RAM for real. Instead of paging everything on the assumption eventually you would run out of RAM, so we've got to keep as much free as possible, except that meant that everything that loaded ever would get paged right back out. So yeah, it was a vicious cycle. So that's your little super secret tip that probably no one will ever use, but that I discovered, and it made a massive difference in everything that I did. Conservative swap file usage equals 1, and all of a sudden Windows 98 and up were amazing. Anyway, that's enough of this. Like, comment, subscribe, and blah, blah, blah. Take it easy. Have a good one. The hard drive clatter just doesn't stop. Go. Go, dude. What are you doing? God, it's 65 through here. Why the hell are you going 55 to get on the highway?